Welcome to the RAMP webinar series. This is section 5, annual agreements. I am Mark Carranz, a adjunct professor at Marquette University and an ASCA model and RAMP trainer. And my co-presenter?
I'm Karen Griffith. I'm assistant professor at the University of Georgia, retired school counselor, and a national trainer.
So we are happy that you joined us today. We want to start to just put some disclaimers out there to encourage you always check the website to ensure you're using the most current RAMP rubric. Not that it changes significantly, but often or sometimes there are tweaks to it. Then during the webinar, please kind of think about the procedures as we talk and demonstrate them. And it's just key that in this process of completing a RAMP application that you really use the RAMP as a guideline. Make sure you read the criteria very clearly and use that to evaluate your progress. So we're talking about annual agreements, which is worth 4 points. There's more information, a lot more information in the Ask a National Model and the Ask a National Model Implementation Guide. So the annual agreement really is helping you speak to your administrators and get them to understand your role and responsibilities. So it's really engaging stakeholders, and primarily that's your building administrator. So in this process, this collaborative process, you want to make this a very formal discussion about the annual agreement. And the annual agreement reflects your goals. It reflects kind of your focus, your use of time, your professional development needs. So make sure that this isn't just something that happens at a moment's notice, but that you schedule time and you have kind of clearly thought about the key points. Use the annual agreement template to guide that conversation. It's important that the annual agreement is completed and signed in the first 2 months of the school. When you're having a formal conversation with your administrator, you want to really make sure that you speak about how the program is data-driven. That resonates with administrators and other stakeholders. This is a great opportunity to really begin to talk about your use of time. I think it's really important to recognize that when you analyze your use of time, the goal is to get to 80% direct and indirect services and 20% program support. If you're not there yet, that's great. Use it as a baseline and use it as a conversation starter to get the administrator to see where you need to really align with best practice and the research around the Ask a National Model. And so you can have very specific conversations about, do I want to spend more time in core curriculum? Do I need to spend more time in responsive services, indirect services? And of course, it really is based on the culture and the needs and the data of your school. This is a great opportunity to talk about your professional development needs as a school counselor. So just some specifics in the rubric. You have an annual agreement for each school counselor. Now that does not mean that you can't come together as a team and talk about the annual agreement and develop it together as a team, but each school counselor has their own annual agreement. It's signed by the counselor and the administrator that supervises the school counselors within the first 2 months of the school year. And that's critical. So if school starts on August 15th, you can do the math. That means September 15th, October 15th, it needs to be completed and signed. Like I said, I think it's really important that you use the annual agreement to advocate for your role as a school counselor, and you need to be painting that vision of 80% of your time is direct or indirectly connected or working with students. And like I said, if you're not there, let's say you're at 70%, then look specifically what can be reduced in maybe program support or even non-counseling duties, and what can be increased in direct and indirect services. The school counseling annual agreement incorporates your school counseling mission statement, so it's a good opportunity to speak to that. Something that, I mean, and this is probably a really good example of making sure you check the website to always use the most recent rubric and make sure you have the newest template. The annual agreement is a great example. There's been some tweaking to the annual agreement about a year ago, maybe a little longer. And on the third page of the annual agreement, you'll see that it's a little more detailed in terms of listing the school counselor specific responsibilities. You know, it breaks out in terms of how do you divide up your caseload? What are the responsibilities in terms of direct services, indirect services, responsive services, special programs, and any other kinds of things that you're responsible for? So that's new, and it needs to be part of your conversation and part of the annual agreement. One of the things I think that's really great about the annual agreement is it helps you identify your professional development needs for the year. They may be related to your program goals, and you may recognize that you want to have some more information, you want to explore some best practices by attending some conferences. I think this is a great place to say you need to attend your state conference. Maybe you can get budgeted dollars for state, or even then ask a national conference. But don't limit professional development just to conferences. Maybe you're going to do a book study. Maybe you're going to engage in an Ask a You and use that kind of as the focus of your professional learning community. There's lots of ways to develop yourself as a school counselor. The webinars are a great example. And then the last point there is just really basically linking you to the annual green template. I love this section because it's part of the Ask a National Model Implementation Guide, and it just gives you a few examples of the do's and don'ts in completing annual agreements. I think it's a great reflective piece. I think when you're ready to move forward with your annual agreement and have that formal conversation, this is a good place just to kind of go in and do a self-check. And you'll see many of the things that we've talked about. What I want to say a little more about, having one agreement per counselor. I think it's important that each agreement is distinct, but that doesn't mean that you could all have the same program goals, and that's fine. You're definitely going to have the same school counseling mission statement. Where you might see some differences is in caseload and school counsel responsibilities. I mean, you might have someone, and again, we're speaking about school counseling sites that have more than one school counselor. If you're the only school counselor, then you're doing everything. But you might have some distinct roles, within the department. You might be the person who's responsible for, serving on the leadership team. You might take the lead and coordinate all the post-secondary reps that come into the building and coordinate that material, make sure students and parents understand the schedule and can take advantage of that. You might be the person who's takes the lead in making sure the annual calendar is up to date, and you tweak it and maybe link that, take on that responsibility for communicating through your electronic newsletter, however that's done in your school. So even though agreements are similar, there's still some very distinct differences. There might be a difference in your use of time based on responsibilities. And we're looking for that target of 80%, maybe as an average for all school counselors, but someone may do a little more program support, and then someone else may be doing more direct or indirect services. I think it's really important when you go into the meeting with your administrator that you really understand your data and you can speak to it. You can identify the places where you you've taken that data from your student information system, from surveys, whatever you use. And then I think the don'ts are pretty straightforward. Don't just drop in. Don't assume that the principal is going to just agree to everything. Be willing to compromise. You want their input. But I think, as we have learned over time, as school counselors have applied for RAMP multiple times, administrators really have seen this annual agreement process as really exemplary.
So I'm going to begin talking about use of time. And this first slide is just to sort of talk about how we think about the way we spend our time, how we define it, and why we think about it in the first place. And this first bullet is talking about the fact that you have to know where you are currently in order to determine where you need to go next. Nobody starts at that 80-20 split. I think that 80-20 is the ideal, and it's hard to accomplish. So one of the best things you can do is do that use of time assessment that is available through ASCA. You can use the one that ASCA provides. You can also just sit with one of your calendars. Be particularly careful about entering all of your activities one week, and then sit with a highlighter and highlight things that are direct, things that are indirect, and things that are program support, and calculate, see where you are. You have to know how you spent your time last year to set your personal goal for where you want to get to this year. So one of the pieces of supporting documentation that you can bring to this meeting are your use of time assessments from the previous academic year. That's what's going to show your administrator where your time was last year and give you a reason to suggest that you need to do something differently. I know in my own practice, I was always surprised by how much program support I had. And each year there was an opportunity for me to try and remove one of those things that would move me towards the 80-20. So that use of time assessment can be an important artifact to take with you to the meeting, and supporting documentation to upload in your application. In the process, you need to identify all the barriers that make it hard for you to get to that 80-20. What is it that's getting in the way? Do you have some duties and responsibility that are I'll call them extraordinary. They're just more than they should be. Some pieces that are taking up your time. It's common for counselors, and I think appropriate for counselors, to be involved in the RTI process, for example. But we shouldn't be the people who are scheduling the meetings. That gets in the way of us being able to deliver those direct and indirect services. So being very specific about what's getting in the way of you reaching that 80-20 is helpful, because you need to be able to specify that to your administrator. You also need to spend some time analyzing this and explaining it with important stakeholders. It's a good thing to include in your advisory council. I think it's a good thing to explain to your faculty and staff exactly where your time is going. I think it's important for us to, I call it demystify our jobs. Nobody seems to know what we really do. And telling them how our time is spent is one way that we help them understand all the things that we are doing. That when we're sitting in our offices with a child, we are working, and there's something meaningful going on there. You want to always make sure that you're shooting for that majority of time, 80%, being spent in direct and indirect services to students. I would use those use of time assessments at least twice a year. Sometimes people use them more. It depends on your own needs, but at least twice a year, stop and calculate where your time is being spent. By the end of the year, you can compare it to last year's assessments and see if you met your agreed upon targets for time usage as you identified in your annual agreement during that first month of the school year. So in order to be able to define how your time is being spent, I think it's important for you to know how ASCA defines each of the ways in which we work with children. So starting with the next slide, I'm going to give you ASCA's definitions for direct services. So core curriculum are the lessons that we deliver to all students within a grade level or a school. It's not just a large group of students. It has to be all of the students, all of the fourth graders, all of the ninth graders, all seniors. The key word there is all. It's when you deliver lessons to all, that's what makes it core curriculum. We used to call it classroom guidance. We've tried to get away from that word and call them core curriculum lessons now. Responsive small groups are groups that meet a minimum of 4 times, lasting 20 minutes or more, maybe as much as 45. They are typically need-driven, and we tend to have 3 to 10 students in a small group. You get much larger than that, and it's not a small group anymore. So core curriculum, responsive small groups, those are pretty straightforward, and most people seem to understand that. Individual student planning is sometimes confusing, and it's easy to get confused between individual student planning and individual counseling. So let's look at the student planning. This happens one-on-one with a student, and it includes anything that you're doing around academic planning or course enrollment or the graduation plans, learning plans, what needs to happen in order to keep them on track for graduation. ASCA identifies 2 specific types of individual student planning. The appraisal session is when you are working with the student to understand that student's own abilities, skills, achievement. It's usually based on some assessments that had been administered, whether they are achievement-based, career-based, skill-based, need-based. It's going over what the student can do. Even in the elementary school, we would sometimes do appraisal sessions with students where we would talk about those standardized tests that they have to take every year. And we would look at each child, didn't take long, looked at what they did on their test last year, helped them identify strengths, set a goal for this year, and then move to the next child. It's a very brief session, but it's specifically geared to that student's some kind of test or analysis. Advisement is when we're working with this student to make decisions about course taking patterns or what kind of program of study they need across their high school experience. What is it that's going to get them ready? It's making those decisions that are going to help them best meet their academic, career, and social emotional needs. Then on the next slide, we get into individual counseling. Now, individual counseling is when you're using your specific mental health training, your expertise. Nobody else in the building can deliver this. This is you alone. You're the one who's trained. And it includes things like when we do the solution focus sessions or brief counseling, when we talk about barriers that are happening for the student around achievement or anything that's getting in the way of their own success. We are helping them work through problems, coming up with ways to make better decisions, setting goals, both long-term and short-term. And it also includes some short-term intervention for crisis when we have to deal with that until the long-term community resources available for them. All of that is individual counseling. The student who comes in upset over some loss, we might deal with them immediately, and then we get them connected to some grief resources beyond the building. All of that is included under individual counseling. Crisis response are those things that require us to drop everything and deal with them. Now, I think that we as counselors need to do a better job of educating our stakeholders and the people in our building about exactly what a crisis is. It's all those things that make you stop what you're doing and deal with this immediately. It's an emergency, and it requires immediate attention. Crisis response is that instantaneous attention that we deliver to a child who's experienced some kind of critical situation, but it also includes any kind of intervention or follow-up that comes even later or a day or two later. All of those are categorized under the umbrella of crisis response. And those make up the direct services. The next slide begins talking about our indirect services to students. We all understand these. Referrals are when we are connecting students to outside resources. Perhaps we get them connected to some tutoring services, or we give them a list of tutoring services that are available, or some academic camps or things that are happening in the school building that might help them with their academic progress. Career support around getting them directed to websites, career fairs, visits, any of those things where we're referring them to someone else, some other agency, some other site to give them support around their career development. Same thing with social emotional support. It's all about getting them connected to those community resources. Those are referrals. Consultation is when you, as the counselor, are working with somebody else who is working with the student to come up with better strategies that are going to make the student more likely to be successful. So consultation is when you meet with parents or teachers or other educators or other agencies and help them come up with ways they can best support and meet student needs. It's usually around promoting student achievement. Sometimes it's around the social, emotional, and career support. All of it's going to make the child more able to be successful in the school building. A conference is any time that the school counselor is meeting with somebody else who is directly involved with the student or indirectly involved with the student. ASCA says it's 15 minutes or more. It's not those 3-minute conversations that happen in the hallway. We all have those. This is a conference that happens where you're actually a little bit more purposeful, more intentional, 15 minutes or more, and you're focused on how to help the student be more successful in school. Okay, so indirect services include referrals, consultation, and conference. And then they also include collaboration. Now, collaboration is when you and another individual are working toward a common goal. You're working with other teachers in the building or with parents or with communities, any of the things that are being employed to help students achieve and to advocate for equity and access. So it might be when you team or partner with another teacher in the building to accomplish one of your goals, one of your lessons, any kind of support that you bring in. There are study skills, homework help organizations that sometimes come into school buildings, and that's usually handled with the counselor in collaboration with making that happen for students who are in the greatest need. It also includes the counselor serving on committees, either in the school building or at the district level or the state level. When you're serving on those committees, it's more than just sitting at the table. It's being a voice and advocating for what students need. It's advocating for what school counselors need to be doing. It's the counselor being a voice for the profession, for the student, anything that helps make the students more successful. And even parent workshops can come under this category of collaboration, because in that role, when you're conducting workshops, you are collaborating with parents on how to help them help their students be more successful in school. So all of that is included as part of collaboration. There's a couple more examples of indirect services for students, beginning on the next slide. Checking in, all counselors, I think, do this. It's that very brief meeting between the school counselor and somebody else. It could be the parent or the teacher or administrator. It's less than 15 minutes. So this is where those 3-minute conversations in the hallway do count. The primary focus, though, has to be about information around that student and making them more successful. Your multi-tiered systems of support, this is things like PBIS, RTI, all of those broader-based systems, multi-layered, that help the student achieve what they need to do. And then student support teams, or whatever name that committee goes by in various districts. Those are the meetings where all of the professionals in the building, parents come in, hopefully, and they sit down and they talk about, what does this child need? What does the teacher need to do differently? The student, the parent, the school. What do we need to do to make this child more successful? And again, this goes back to understanding that it's our role in that meeting where we are providing our thoughts and our expertise around what the child might need, being the voice for those who might not have as powerful a voice as they need. That's an indirect service to student. Scheduling those meetings, being responsible for the note-taking, or making sure that the interventions suggested are being carried out. Those are not indirect services. Those are going to fall into the program support. So it's when you're sitting in that meeting as the voice of an expert and an advocate, that's when it's an indirect service to students. And finally, the next slide talks about program support. Now, program support is basically everything else. All of the things that you do to make your program work come under program management. That includes the meetings that you have, the planning that you do for your lessons and your interventions, the analysis of data, the collection of data, all of those pieces that make your program run are program management. Now, fair share duties are those that we have to do just like everybody else in the building. Sometimes we have lunch duty. Sometimes we have bus duty. The important piece is for us to not have all of the lunch duty or all of the bus duty. We're willing to do our fair share, but we don't want to spend so much time in these kinds of duties that it then creates a barrier for us to provide the services that students need. And then there are all those other duties as assigned, the non-school counseling tasks. And these are a challenge to every counselor I've ever known, because they can take over your life if you're not careful. And they're the things that we really need to strongly advocate for them to at least be few in number or very limited. But this is a list of some examples. Coordinating any kind of standardized testing, that's a non-counseling task. Being involved in disciplinary actions that include giving the consequences, that is not just a non-school counseling class task. That is a I would call it an anti-counseling task. It operates counter to who we want to be in the building. Being a substitute teacher or covering classes for teachers who are absent or need to go to a meeting, non-school counseling task. Supervising classrooms or common areas. Now, we do our fair share, but we don't want to be the only person who's doing that. That's when it becomes a non-counseling task. We don't provide long-term therapy or counseling. Our caseloads are too huge. We don't have time to see students for 50 minutes a shot once a week for 52 weeks. That's not what we do. We provide short-term interventions and then refer them out as needed. Coordinating school-wide big events, big programs, those can be non-school counseling tasks. I think specifically of some of the PBIS plans for incentives, the attendance incentive plans. We have to be careful with those because when we are coordinating those kinds of big school incentive plans that anybody else could do, then that's when it's a non-school counseling task. And finally, serving as a data entry clerk. Obviously, high school counselors are fully involved in the selection of courses and programs of studies for their high school students. But hopefully, there's somebody else who's making the actual changes in the computer systems. We're in the advising role, not the data entry role. So understanding exactly what makes up the pieces of our time and how our time is spent helps you define them for others and evaluate where your time is going.
The annual agreement narrative really allows you to kind of talk about the process of developing your narrative. Karen and I will really tell you the best way to move forward with writing a narrative is to take each of the bullet points, and in this case there's 3, and turn that bullet point into an introductory sentence, and then the paragraph that follows addresses the bullet point. So in this case, you would generally have 3 paragraphs and speak directly to the bulleted point. You have limited words. I believe it's 750, so you have to be very concise and very specific about answering or responding to that statement. So the 3 bullet points, how the annual agreement was developed and reflects that discussion with the administrator. So you want to cite examples that you shared and talked about how data was involved in developing your goals that are part of the annual agreement. You want to be able to capture, when you met, who was there, how long did it take, and some of the other things that were part of that conversation. Maybe you talked about the distribution of duties and who does what. Then you can see the second bullet point talks about the use of time. And Karen did a really good job of helping you understand what that means and why you'd use that use of time assessment. It would be extremely exemplary to use that to generate a conversation with the administrator and capture that, saying, when we did a use of time assessment based on last year's work, we were at 70% direct and indirect. And we want to be aligned with best practice and the ASCA national model. Here's how we think we could begin to move closer to the 80% in terms of direct and indirect. And you can be very specific. We talked about increasing our core curriculum lesson plans, which means then maybe we're not going to spend as much time supervising the lunch hour. And that's the conversation that you want to be able to capture. And then the last one, how the decisions to distribute duties among the school counselors were made. Now, obviously, if you're the only one, this isn't something you're going to speak to because you're doing them all. But in middle schools and high schools, typically, you have more than one school counselor, and you want to be able to talk about why someone is taking the lead in coordinating all the outside resources that are coming into the building to support students in terms of achievement and career development, for example. So this is a very critical piece to the process. If, for example, your use of time isn't at the 80-20%, you want to be able to speak to that and say, here's where we are, here's some of the barriers that we're addressing, and we're moving forward. So you want to be able to talk about that. Oftentimes in the rubric, you'll see it under the exemplary section of the rubric. So in this case, the exemplary section is going to get you 5 points. You'll see some words that talk about highly detailed. In my opinion, highly detailed means you cite examples, not just one, more than one. So I think that's really important in this process. Our last slide really just kind of summarizes some of the pitfalls that RAMP reviewers have seen over time that really kind of impact the score. And you can see not having it signed in the first 2 months is really critical. Not addressing and completing all the components in the annual agreement. And if it doesn't apply, you need to say that, don't leave it blank. And oftentimes you'll see NA when it comes to the budget line. They didn't use the Ask a template, they modified it in some way. Don't do that. Time allotments, so looking at the 80-20%, and in that 80%, there's core curriculum, there's responsive services, there's individual student planning. How is that broken up? And it does not have to be the same for each school counselor. In my building, some folks did more classroom guidance, and other people were more on call for responsive services. So it can play to your strengths. And if they all look exactly the same, use of time, all the responsibilities and roles, that will not be exemplary. It will look like you just cut and paste and everyone's doing the same thing. And we know that in reality, that can't be true. And then the narrative, like I said, really needs to explain the process. But I think if you address the bullet points with individual paragraphs, that's going to really help the reader, the reviewer, see the process as being addressed. I want to say thank you for joining us in this RAMP webinar on annual agreements. Karen?
Nothing to add. I agree. Thank you. Go back to the rubric, read the books, check the implementation guide for further information. Thank you.
Thank you.